I'm going to cover promises right now because I've realized that I haven't really talked about it. And if you don't have promises, if you don't understand promises, you're going to have a very difficult time using Firebase. Promises have become a very central part of using JavaScript in a professional context. Uh, Promises were not initially baked into JavaScript. For the longest time, you would just use callbacks, and callbacks still work just fine with Firebase, with JavaScript in general. But as the language has matured, as the user base has grown, JavaScript users have decided that they'd much rather use promises than callbacks. So the entire community is really rolled toward that, and Firebase now supports it natively. Now you can build your own support into you can use promises without support from a library, but Firebase has support for promises, so we're just going to dive right into how to use it and how to do it manually if you need to. Okay, so what do we got here? We got a really straightforward Node Node client going on here, and Nodemon is running it automatically down below. So what do we got? We're requiring in Firebase, requiring in Axios. Axios is the creation of a friend of mine, Matt Zabriskie, who created a nice promise-based HTTP library. So we're going to use Axios to do an HTTP request just to show you how it works, and we're going to play around with Firebase as well. Okay, so first, of course, Firebase initialize app, database URL, your service account file, you got to find that. Okay, with those two, you should be good there in your Firebase initialized. Now, I saved a whole bunch of data to this endpoint through this Firebase under swappy/people. So swappy is the Star Wars API. It's a fun little nerdy data source that I use sometimes for these sorts of demos. So we've got all this data. We've got 10 records under 10 people for the swappy API, and they're labeled 1 through 10. Okay, now you can pull down a shallow copy of this. Here, let's just show you exactly what this looks like. So let's console log out keys link. Okay, there we go. Come on, there we go. Okay. So what does this look like? This is the data I get from this endpoint. I've got shallow true. If I just turn shallow to false or get rid of it, I get all the data, which is this whole big chunk of data. Okay, but we're going to play around with using promises to do something totally out of band, some async operations. So we're going to actually play around with this result, which is just the keys, the shallow keys of this endpoint, swappy/people. Now remember, the data looks like this. Okay. There's a null. And we got some more data after that. Okay. So promises. What are promises? The promise object, this is MDN, Mozilla Developer Network. The promise object is used for asynchronous computations. A promise represents an operation that hasn't completed yet but is expected in the future, much like a callback. Okay. Syntax, new promise. You create a promise and you pass in an executor function with a resolve callback and a reject callback. Then you pass data into the resolve or the reject to then resolve or reject that promise. You resolve a promise to resolve it successfully and pass some data out and say, hey, we're done. Call the callbacks, whatever they are, and you reject it to say, hey, we're done, but we failed. Something went wrong. So call the catch or the failure callbacks. Okay. A function, the executor, a function that will be passed to other functions via the arguments resolve and reject. The executor function is executed immediately by the promise implementation, which provides the resolve and reject functions. The executor is called before the promise constructor ever returns the created object. Okay. Promise is in one of these states, pending, fulfilled, or rejected. This is more sophisticated than just callbacks. This is why people like promises. This is why I love promises. You can do some really fun stuff with promises. So promise, fulfill, reject. To fulfill, you can then pass it to an on fulfillment callback using .then, chaining .then off the promise. Or you can use also .then with a rejection callback or a catch. Okay, so other things, other methods, promise.all, you can pass in an array of promises, and it'll wait till all of those promises fulfill before it calls the callback that is spec'd out in .then. There's .race, something I've not used, but this is rad. It returns a promise that resolves or rejects as soon as one of the promises resolves or rejects. So whichever one goes first wins. And then promise.reject and promise.resolve are just passing out values to automatically resolve the rejected promises. So sometimes you'll find yourself saying, hey, I just need to pass out a promise, but it needs to be automatically rejected or automatically resolved. So you can just call promise.reject or promise.resolve to do that, pass a value out. Okay, that's really all you need to know. I don't use race, although if I ever need it, it's good to know that it's there. And of course, promise.all, use it constantly. Okay. All right, so let's go back up. I'm just gonna leave this here, and we're gonna start writing some code. Okay, so I've got my swappy ref, and I've got my keys link, which is this guy right here. It'll return that data. Well, it'll return it with a true. Okay, just like that. And you see here, console.log res.data. So this is how we do it. Axios.get, so we pass in the get, and then the get function Axios, it runs an HTTP get, it returns a promise. So I pass in, using a .then, I pass in the data, well, the callback. So there we go. Now let's say I could pass in right here, I could pass in a function with an error, console log error. Okay, see that? So now let's put something stupid in here. JSON blah blah. What happens? Oh, look, data not found. It's going to log out. Huh, that's ugly. Let's do it again. So error. So because there was an error, the first callback in a .then is the success. The second is an error. Also, instead of doing a callback like that, you can say .catch. I don't want to read the whole error out because that is just annoying. But look, see, it reads out as error. Run it again. Yeah, we get another error. Okay, so this catch will be called no matter which function in the chain fails. So this is the fun part. Okay, check this out. Okay, so we've got, let's fix this. We want to actually get real data. And now we're going to say var keys equals object.keys res.data. Now we're going to log out keys. All right, so we got our keys. Awesome. Now we're going to say var promises. This is getting a little advanced. We're just going to do it right off the bat just to make it perfect. Okay, I want to say promises.push. Ready for this? Swappy ref.child. Oh, crud. No. Keys.for each function key. So that'll be called for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Promises.push swappyref.child key dot once value. Okay. So dot once returns a promise. So I go get my swappyref, got my child.key, and then instead of calling dot on value and passing it a callback, I call dot once and pass in just the value, which is the event that I'm listening to. And so it'll listen and return a promise. So I could call .then and pass in a callback, but I'm not. What I'm going to do is just collect those promises right here in this promises array. Okay? So promises.push, I'm just going to push all the promises on. Then I'm going to say return promise.all promises. Okay. And now so I returned a promise, values. Okay, ready for this? Save. There we go. Now, this makes no sense. So let's just console log out values.length. Okay, 10. Okay, so there are going to be 10 values. Each of these values is going to be a snapshot. So this is how we use promises to collect a whole bunch of asynchronous operations and then wait for them all to finish. So this is a fun little system that I use quite a bit. You couldn't really do this with callbacks. I mean, I guess it's possible. You'd have to like do some counting and say, hey, once these are all done, then run it. This is a much cleaner interface. So let's just cover again what we're doing. Axios.get returns a promise. So to pass a callback to a promise, we call .then and pass the callback into the .then function from the promise. So whatever Axios.get's going to return is going to be an argument. We're going to call that argument res because response, that's a common pattern with Axios. And so res.data is the data. You can see it looks like it's like this up here with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we're just going to pull those keys off. Then we're going to make an array of promises. We're going to loop through all the keys and push a new promise for each key to the promises array, then called promise.all. Okay, so that will then return a new promise. I could call .then off of this and pass my own function in if I needed to. I could say, hey, values here, and I could say, check this out, return new promise, function, resolve, reject. So now I'm going to do my own manual promise. I'm going to say, set timeout, function, okay. We're going to just wait, just 500 millis. We're going to console log out, waited 500 millis. And then I'm going to just return out, I'm going to call the resolve function and say resolve values. So I'm just going to do a little pass through here. So it'll wait till all of these. So all of these promises will get fulfilled. All these values will get their once value event called. Then the then function, the callback here will get returned. But then I'm going to return from inside the then. I'm going to return a new promise, which means I'll be able to chain to it again down here because the return. That means down here we're out of this function right here. We're getting another promise, so I can call .then, and I'm going to manually wait 500 millis and then resolve this manual promise with the values, just to pass through. Okay, there we go. Waited 500 millis, values 10. Okay, RS, do it again. Bam. Waited 500 millis, values 10. Gets back down here. Now I can switch this to, I can comment that out and say reject. Yikes. So now I'm going to reject the promise instead of resolving it, and error. Let's just, there we go. Waited 500 millis, then error. Yikes. Okay. So no matter where the failure occurs, as long as we're returning promises from each callback should return a promise. Eventually we get down to, well, if each callback returns a promise, then we can continue to chain .then. So if it doesn't return it, so if we say right here, oh, forget to return it, cannot read property length if undefined, waited 500 millis, it'll do its thing, but we're gonna have a problem. So we're going to return promise.all. Okay. All right. What else do we need to cover? Oh yeah, we can return just values. Return 500, 5,000. Okay, 5,000, some number, console, some number. Oh, still got an error. Let's resolve that. There. Okay, so we can just return out just a value, and it'll act as a resolved promise. But if I could also do promise.resolve. Okay, or I could do promise.reject. Return a rejection, and the rejection just drops me down here. Okay, so that is how you use promise.all. Not promise.race, because I don't really, I mean, we could use promise.race as well. Value 6. So, yeah. Promise.race does its thing as well, but we're not going to worry about that. Promise.all, promise.race, promise.reject, and promise.resolve. Okay. And, of course, the core promise API, which is new promise with an executor function. And notice how we can chain internally. So any promise can chain, and we can do chaining within a chain. We can chain within a chain within a chain. We can nest it however we like. And this thing can go on forever and ever and ever. Just to show you how this really would work, I wouldn't chain this. I would say values I would just return promises.race or promises.all and chain directly off of that. So as long as I've got a promise coming out of the function, I can call .then and just keep on chaining. Okay, there, I think I've covered it all. That's everything I'm interested in covering. Let me know if you've got any questions, and rock and roll with these promises. Use them with Firebase, use them with Axios, use them manually yourself in Node or in a compatible browser. Let's just check real quick. I think, it's hard to read this. Browser support, browser compatibility, Chrome 32, Edge, yes. Internet Explorer, of course not. Opera and Safari. So, you can use new promise anywhere you like. And if you're really worried about Internet Explorer support, there are promise libraries that let you generate these promises through the library instead. So, okay, use promises. Bye. See you next time.